Thanks to the members of the creation group this last week, in week 7, for your contributions to the forum discussion. Some really great responses, I think, to the 3 kinds of question that I put to you. Made some notes here after reading your contributions and just want to offer a little bit of reaction to them. Maybe to encourage certain lines, I think, of reflection and interpretation that I'm seeing emerge here. I think one of the first things that I want to highlight that several of you mentioned, Tim, you especially emphasized this, and I want to highlight it because I think it's really important to grasp the kind of rhetorical force of this passage, and that is that Paul is offering these words of assurance to people who are enduring a particular kind of suffering and facing a particular kind of suffering. And Brian, you did a good job, I thought, drawing from Grieb, the sort of her interpretation of the kinds of suffering that are in view per the list that Paul gives, especially at the end, of what might be thought to separate the readers of this letter and us from the love of God in Christ, that might be thought to separate them from enjoying bodily the power of transformation and hope that Paul has been describing. And that list is the sword, famine, various kinds of difficulty that are not just random in the world, but are associated with the pursuit of a life that challenges the existing distribution of power. And that is crucial, I think. And Tim, I appreciate you highlighting this context of suffering, because otherwise it's quite easy for these words to become a kind of empty triumphalism, where Christians in any kind of position in society or perceived difficulty simply celebrate that they're more than conquerors and winning in Jesus and this kind of thing. And it's not really drawing on this assurance for what it is, which is to encourage people who are committed to the faithful ways of Jesus and the difficulty that comes with that. That, I think, is the kind of context in which this assurance really has its traction. And so that is worth emphasizing. Several of you mentioned, the merits, I think, of Elsa Tames's article that we read, and what she adds to this discussion, especially in relation to certain kinds of suffering, and I think complicating in a very helpful way the way this passage speaks not to people as sort of generically coming from the difficulties of sin and guilt, but she reframes the teaching of Paul in Romans so that it's not trying to kind of implicitly beat down the weak for the ways that they have made mistakes, but in some ways encourages them to come to a new understanding of themselves insofar as the power of sin has perhaps led them to underestimate their own worth, to assume a guilt that is not theirs to bear, especially in contexts where bearing that guilt means reinforcing their position of subordination. So I really agree and resonate with those comments from several of you. Priscilla, you mentioned this about Tamis. Helen, you also did. Amanda, you did. Several others here. So I want us to continue to think about the power of sin and how the Spirit works in it, the hope the Spirit cultivates in the midst of that difficulty, with that nuance that Tamis brings to this discussion. So um, I also, I think, was struck by the way several of you, I think, helpfully showed, or at least pointed to how Dames's article articulates the relation, the dynamic between the psychological and the structural. I saw this especially in Amanda's and Sarah's, Niran's as well. These are really great observations about what she shows, because we can underestimate the extent to which the psychology of each of us is in some measure a reflection of the wider structural patterns of our life, shared life with other people. And so it's in dynamic kind of relation with structural powers, structures of society, imaginations of oneself that are promoted by the patterns of our society. And taking that into account, I think we're able to grasp better why Paul can move so seamlessly between the psychological and even the cosmic. So I just hope that this is giving you a perhaps somewhat more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the human as a creature among others, because often we have kind of reified certain ways of seeing the human, say the inner life of the human or something, so that the way that it depends on all kinds of other matters is lost to our view. And then I think we end up prioritizing certain dimensions of the human in a way that isn't really true to the complexity of human life and all that it is. Along these lines, several of you made a move that I thought was quite striking, and that I think I'm pretty friendly to, and that is that the relation between the psychological and the structural is not only negative. It's not only the case that sin that is corrupting in a structural way our fabric of society is at once involved in some of the corruption that happens to us psychologically. But you also, I think, pointed to how the structural relation between the psychological and, say, the social means that there are ways in which God's work in all creation to redeem it can be reflected structurally, that there can be structural changes that are redemptive and that even aid the psychological health of people. And of course, Paul's given us all kinds of good reasons, I think, to be careful about sort of pretending that having the right laws, the right rules, instituting the right sort of structures on its own is going to lead to a reliable healing. I think he's warned us against that, so that we have to remain constantly vigilant about how established institutions can be easily exploited by other powers in the world. But that doesn't negate what I think you all are observing, which is that good rules, good laws, institutions of various kinds can serve the healing of the human when they are used in a redemptive way. And so that was just a helpful, I think, added dimension that we should not neglect. And I appreciate you all drawing attention to that. Several of you, I think, also pointed out something important. Niran, you talked a little bit about this. Winston, you also talked about this. And that is that our election in Christ, the way that we are participating in God's decisively shaping the future of the human, the way that we're already caught up in that irrevocably, is about our being conformed to the image of the Son, in the language of Paul. So that election is not primarily focused on, where we end up when we die, as predestination is often thought to indicate. God's election of the human in Christ is about God's empowering the human in Christ to be transformed into the likeness of Jesus. That is the goal of election. And of course, it does entail the healing, and I think finally the resurrection of the human. But we often neglect that transformative commitment of God's election, that allows people to talk about it as if, it assured their future without entailing their transformation in the present. And we don't want to settle for that kind of cheap election, which, as I mentioned in the podcast, has often been complicit in various kinds of Euro-American white supremacy. This sense that some civilization, some political order that arises from a dominant form of Christian society in the world exhibits God's choice, God's favor, and is therefore entitled to subordinate other parts of the human. And that sort of understanding of election, I think, has abandoned basically the teaching of Paul here, that election is about being conformed to Jesus, who we see quite clearly did not take his calling as the final king of Israel or the one to inherit all the peoples of the world as some justification for his dominance over others. Quite the contrary. It was the basis for his self-giving. So that's an important observation. Kyung Gran and Rod, you both brought up something that I thought was just a good highlight from Damis that I want to mention here, and that is that she is opposing the tendency of some of the Christian tradition to reduce Paul's teaching on justification, on forgiveness, on atonement, to some kind of legal transaction, which often gets conflated with forgiveness or something like that, as if the concern of Paul were to give people a better status, but not change the actual shape and experience and health of their lives in community and as individuals as well. And I think Damis is right to insist that atonement, for example, as you say, Rod, in Paul, is about a powerful transformation. It is a change in the dynamics and conditions of the life of the human, not simply some status or something along those lines. And that's why for Damis, I think she wants to insist that the atonement for sin, justification, these are matters of the carrying out of justice in the world, as opposed to giving the unjust the insulation of some right status before God, something along those lines. I kind of wish that she would try to vindicate a term like forgiveness instead of simply kind of associating it with the way that it is poorly used, because I think pardon or forgiveness in Paul, thinking here of chapter 4, but also in other parts of the New Testament, is not about simply kind of settling for a corrupt state of affairs or choosing not to feel bad about it or choosing not to pursue any reprisal, or vengeance. Forgiveness in the New Testament, and I think this continues its theme in the Old Testament, entails bodily transformation, bodily healing. You might remember in the gospel story that the power of the Son of Man to forgive sins is expressed in the power of the Son of Man to bring healing to a paralyzed man's body. and therefore to the relations that constitute that body for what it is. So the tendency that we have had in some circles to distinguish neatly between forgiveness and healing, or to treat forgiveness as some kind of legal transaction that doesn't really entail any bodily healing or change in the conditions of life on the ground, I think is not really true to Paul's teaching or the rest of the New Testament. So I think we want to try to recover a more sound use of the term and the concept of pardon or forgiveness, so that it actually involves bodily transformation rather than simply kind of empty pronouncements or declarations about the status of people. Maybe last couple things here. Marshall, I thought you were right to talk about the correspondence between love, as Paul talks about it in chapter 5, and what comes out at the very end in chapter 8, so that especially love as what the law commands and what its fulfillment actually involves is thematic to all that Paul has been arguing, even if the term crops up only at kind of strategically climactic moments. Love is really programmatic for the way of God with the human, and what God as creator, as well as God as the God of Israel, what God promotes in God's people and in the whole world. So the thing that I would want to emphasize there is how love is not just a sentiment, but a practice in the Bible, both when it's God's and when it is the activity of human beings. The other thing that maybe is worth emphasizing here, and this is also where I wanted to speak a little bit to David's discussion of this transformation of the human in Christ, that we really want to see, especially in the latter part of the passages that we studied for this week, the figure of Christ as central, and our life in relation to Christ, when that is a matter of God's calling, God's election, our justification, glorification, these things. Because if we lose sight of this, I think that we will not have an adequate sense of the context in which this transformation that we're talking about, this healing of all creation, of which the human is a witness in Christ, we won't be able to grasp that depends on community life. Life in Christ is a life of people sharing their lives with one another according to a particular pattern, learning that pattern of Jesus as their own, as their ways of relating to one another. And if we don't have this in view, then I fear that things get a little bit too ethereal, meaning there's supposedly this transformation happening in Christ, but without specifying that life in Christ is a practice of community with one another. And so then you get into this sort of already not yet tension that is sort of vague. We're all sort of caught up in this tension within ourselves or whatever, supposedly, and we're not really able to name that God has gathered people in particular contexts in the world to be able to experience this healing work of the Spirit, which is the power of resurrection already at work in them. And it affects their relationships. It affects how they treat one another. It affects the character of each person in that kind of practice of community as they grow through that sort of practice. So I just think that to talk about, as you did, Marshall, the love of God in Christ as a practice invites us to develop that in terms of where and how that practice of love is happening, and to not neglect that so that we can see how this spirit of the age to come, the spirit of resurrection, is in fact working bodily in the present, as opposed to us just kind of living in a tension in which there's no traction for growth. It's just kind of this, it's always hard. We're always getting better. We're never already there. I think we want to be able to say the good news that the way God raised Jesus from among the dead and then spilled that spirit of resurrection into the human through him does result in power for change, but it's power for change that unfolds especially through the dynamics of community, which is that life in Christ, that life of the baptized, people who are baptized into that community life of Christ together. So that is maybe one last thing that I wanted to highlight. So that is basically what I wanted to share. I hope that that helps you continue to develop your thinking, your take on this letter. And I'm looking forward to how we're going to start drawing on what we've worked on in the first 2/3 of the class as we move now into some really rich passages about this life together that Paul then develops starting in chapter 9 through the end of the letter. Thanks again for a great discussion this past week, everybody.